In the name of God, Creator, Redeemer and Sanctifier. Amen. One of the most hilarious conversations I've ever had with American was trying to explain Test cricket. How could only two teams play a game for 5 days and not have a result, and for that to still be exciting? Some American games feel like they go on for 5 hours, if you've ever watched their football. But there will always be a winner. And often that's because you can point to the loser, because being better is not as good as being the best. But it's the comparative judgments that so leave everyone the poorer. So today's parable is just not cricket. The all-day workers feel they've not been treated fairly enough and are certainly not happy for the workers who put in less time when, by any sort of maths, they are very much better off than those who've been in the field all day. It's like their hot and tired faces have been rubbed in it. Come sunset, the landowner deliberately pays the more recent workers first. There's no doubt that he exhibits incredible generosity. As for the workers for 1 and then 2 or only 3 hours are paid the same. He's a very generous employer and clearly has the funds to continue to be generous. So those who've been there all day are anticipating a very generous windfall. But to their intense irritation, the landowner's generosity runs dry. One commentator put it, "They cannot appreciate the absolute gain of all because they want the relative gain of some, that is themselves. It's not sufficient for me to succeed, my friend also has to fail." This parable is yet another very disconcerting story in which the have-nots do rather better, very much to everyone's surprise, than the haves. But let's step back a bit and put this into context. The incidents immediately before this parable are of the value of those who give up everything to follow Jesus. The rich young ruler, clearly otherwise entirely virtuous, has asked Jesus if there is any more he should do to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the answer is again, give up everything, sell your possessions. Summarising, it's more difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. And the disciples are horrified. Who then, if not this man, could be assured the kingdom of heaven? And they have given up everything. The all-day workers might well be considered to be the disciples of, they've borne the burden, most of which I would add is yet to come in Jerusalem and beyond. So how could they not be rewarded with more than the Johnny or Jill's come lately? It's worth considering who the apparently have-mores and have-lesses are. Then, and then of course now. The have-nots, the have-less, the have-littles, that could include those who didn't get work earlier in the day and who spent most of the day expecting to take home considerably less finances to their family than the others. The other have-less or have-nots might also include the all-day workers who have worked all day and carry the burden of that labour in their bodies. So who then are the have-mores? The all-day workers, who, no matter the generosity or stinginess of the landowner, would go home with a certain, predictable and confident payment for their families. And as the disciples listened to this parable, who are the have-mores? those who've been with Jesus the longest, those who followed him from the start, who have day by day experienced his teaching and healing, his love and compassion, and his resistance to cruelty, especially to those who are marginalised. Who of us wouldn't want to have heard Jesus' call so clearly and been able to eat and drink and sit with him? We humans can be so envious, and sometimes we're just downright mean. And in this parable, I think, which is true nowadays too, we're not always envious of the landowner's wealth. We're more often envious of someone else getting more or getting the jump on us, especially when we judge that the more is not just and it's not fair. All of us, disciples and more recent Christians alike, are at once and at the same time the have-mores and the haves less. I believe part of what brings us into the kingdom of heaven is recognising that our human tendency to this comparative envy, it's not of the kingdom, not least because it's not necessary. So if we move into the "I've won because you've lost," in Jesus we are all lost until he wins us life always. If we do the "I've earned more because you've worked less," it's only the work of the cross that assures us of grace. And there are many, many jealousies, often about status and the unequal power of economic, social, abled, education, or health circumstances of those around us, when we know we actually don't deserve anything. It is God's incredible grace which makes us worthy in God's sight, nothing else. So this is a hard news parable for the disciples. And Paul Peter gets again to ask the wrong question. What will be there for us? And Jesus' response is how we behave to each other. That's what really matters. So, the answer to those disciples then and us now, put aside envy and jealousy and understand that in the kingdom of heaven, the compassion of our God is supreme to the justice God might mete out, and aren't we grateful for that? So how does this rather awkward parable sit with us? Well, for a start, it is to us. The parable is addressed to the disciples. The crowds are still around as Matthew records it, but this series on forgiveness and status and the way to behave in community is addressed directly to the disciples, the believers and the carriers of the stories of the good news. This is a parable for us. Secondly, or another item, you may be a cradle Anglican, many of us aren't, but we are all Johnny and Jill's come lately. The span of our lives is immaterial when put against the millennia of saints who have told the story, lived the good news, all for our benefit. That we come, that we answer God's invitation at all, is what matters. The best place for us to proclaim, to be a living witness to the good news, is for us to be as close as possible in our behaviour to the landowner, and as far as possible from the all-day workers and the "this is how it should be" group. The closer and harder we stay to the comparative meanness of the long workers, the more likely we are to whinge, and that's what people will hear, and the less like we are to delight in the generosity and boast of the compassion and love of our landowner. In the time BC, that's before COVID, I don't think we always recognised that the limitations with which we surrounded ourselves, nor did I think we recognise the consequences of living in ways which, sometimes literally and often figuratively, actually socially distancing those we considered less or those we judged so different that we could ignore. But now that we're required to be socially distant, it's time to bring ourselves closer. Get out every little while and make sure that everyone's invited in. Get out every little while and come back with what is necessary to live kingdom-wise. And keep going out and bringing people back. Because then, at last, others will see and hear and experience the kingdom perhaps for the first time.